Lonnie Pearson lived alone in a small wooden house on the edge of Sand Hollow, a quiet rural town in Idaho. He was 61 years old, retired from working on the railroad, and now spent his days gardening, fixing things around the property, and taking care of a few chickens. The woods began right behind his backyard, and most days passed peacefully. One hot afternoon in July, Lonnie was bringing in a basket of clean laundry from the line when he heard a strange sound. It didn't sound like a dog. It wasn't a bird either. It was sharp and high-pitched, like an animal crying out in pain. He set the basket down on the porch and looked toward the back of his property. The sound had come from near the old wire fence by the tree line. He moved quickly, his heart starting to beat faster, not because he was afraid, but because he recognized that something was wrong. As he got closer, Lonnie saw it clearly. A young bobcat was caught in the fence. It was tangled in the rusted wire, probably trying to squeeze through. Its back leg was twisted and bleeding where the wire had wrapped around it. The bobcat looked about the size of a small dog, maybe 25 or 30 pounds. Its fur was a mix of tan and reddish brown, now dirty and stuck with leaves. Its ears were flat and its teeth were bared. The bobcat hissed at him, eyes wide, muscles tense. But Lonnie noticed something else too, the way its body trembled. It was exhausted. Each time it tried to pull its leg free, it cried out and then collapsed back down. Lonnie stopped a few feet away. He knew bobcats were wild animals and could be dangerous. One bite or scratch could do serious damage. But he also knew that if he didn't do something soon, the animal might not survive. And the truth was simple. This was his fence, his responsibility. He turned and jogged back to his barn. Inside the barn, Lonnie grabbed everything he might need. Thick leather gloves, an old military blanket, a pair of heavy-duty fence cutters, a bottle of antiseptic spray, and some bandages. Before heading back out, he pulled out his phone and called Laura, a friend who still worked at the wildlife rehab center where he used to volunteer. "If you can, get the blanket over its head," Laura said immediately. "Move slow. Keep your voice calm. Don't make eye contact. Cut the wire as fast as you can once it's covered." "Got it," Lonnie replied. "Wish me luck." Back at the fence, the bobcat was still there, still breathing hard, still bleeding. Lonnie slipped on the gloves and approached slowly, crouching to keep a low profile. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly. "I'm going to help." The bobcat growled but didn't move. Lonnie gently held out the blanket and, in one motion, dropped it over the animal's head. The bobcat jerked hard once, then went still underneath the fabric. Working quickly, Lonnie grabbed the twisted wire and started cutting. The metal bit into the leather gloves, and sweat rolled down his face as he worked. The bobcat let out low growls from under the blanket, but it didn't try to attack. He fumbled once and nearly dropped the cutters, but he didn't stop. He knew time mattered. Finally, with a loud snap, the wire gave way. The bobcat pulled its leg free immediately and stumbled a few steps before collapsing in the nearby grass. It shook off the blanket with its teeth and turned to face him. Blood was still dripping from its ankle, but the wire was gone. For a moment, Lonnie didn't move. He braced himself for the animal to lunge at him, but it didn't. The bobcat slowly stood on 3 legs, stared at him in silence, then turned and limped back toward the trees. At the edge of the forest, it stopped, looked back at him one last time, then disappeared into the woods. Lonnie let out a long breath and dropped to his knees. His hands were still shaking. He looked at the spot where the bobcat had stood and whispered, "I hope you make it." That night, Lonnie didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about the bobcat, He had done what he could, cut it free, stayed calm, avoided injury, but he couldn't shake the image of that leg. The wire had dug in deep, and he hadn't been able to bandage it. There was no way of knowing whether the animal would survive. Before going to bed, he had placed a shallow bowl of water and a small piece of leftover meat near the tree line. He knew feeding wildlife wasn't recommended. In fact, back when he volunteered at the rehab center, he often told visitors not to feed wild animals, especially predators like bobcats. It could make them dependent on humans or too comfortable around people. But this felt different. The bobcat wasn't looking for a handout. It was just in trouble. "I'm not starting a zoo," he mumbled to himself, setting the meat down. "Just a one-time thing." The next morning, as the sun lit up the tops of the pine trees, Lonnie stepped outside and walked toward the fence. The air was still cool, and the grass was wet with dew. He didn't expect anything. Honestly, he figured the meat and water would still be there, untouched. But when he reached the edge of the yard, he stopped. The bowl of water was empty, and the meat was gone. Not picked at, gone completely, like it had been snatched up in one fast motion. Lonnie crouched down and examined the area. The grass was pressed down in a few places, and near the elderberry bush, he saw it. A single paw print in the dirt. It was wider than a house cat's, and the toe pads were spaced just like he remembered from field training. Bobcat. He stood up slowly. The forest was quiet. No sign of movement. But someone had come back. For the next few days, the same thing happened. Lonnie would leave out a small piece of meat, just a scrap, always in a different spot. And in the morning, it would be gone. Sometimes there were paw prints. Once he thought he saw the grass move near the shed. But by the time he turned, nothing was there. He didn't tell anyone. Most of his neighbors were older folks or ranchers. If they knew a bobcat was hanging around, some of them might try to trap it or scare it off. That's not what he wanted. Instead, he kept his distance. No sudden moves, no calls, just quiet observation. On the 5th day, he was sitting on the porch at dusk when he spotted her. She stepped out from the shadows near the trees. Slow, cautious, low to the ground. Her coat was cleaner now. The dried blood had faded. Her legs still looked stiff, but she wasn't limping as much. She stared at him for a moment, then moved toward the spot where he usually left food. There was nothing there today. On purpose. Lonnie had decided to slow things down, let her return to hunting naturally. But she didn't panic. She sniffed around, found nothing, then turned and walked away. No anger, no fear, just understanding. That night, Lonnie sat a little longer on the porch, staring into the trees. He felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not pride, just a quiet connection. Like the world had acknowledged that he had done something right. He whispered into the stillness, "You're welcome to come and go, but don't let me hold you here." By the 2nd week, Lonnie noticed a pattern. The bobcat would show up in the early morning or just after sunset, never at midday. She never came close to the house, and she never made a sound. But she was there, just at the edge of the woods, always watching. Lonnie kept his routine simple. He left small pieces of meat in different areas, gradually farther away from the porch. He avoided looking directly at her. He never tried to call her. He never moved toward her. He respected the space between them. He knew this wasn't friendship, not in the way people usually think about it. It was more like mutual understanding. She was recovering, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, she trusted his presence. One evening, just before dark, Lonnie returned from the market with a bag of groceries. As he reached the porch, he felt a tug on the bottom of the canvas bag. He looked down. The bobcat was there, her head deep inside the bag, sniffing through carrots and parsley. He froze. She didn't growl. She didn't panic. She looked up with a small bunch of parsley hanging from her whiskers, then backed out of the bag and sat calmly on the ground. For the first time, Lonnie laughed out loud. It was a dry, honest laugh, the kind that surprises you when you're alone. "Well," he said, crouching slowly. "That's not Rabbit." The bobcat didn't move. She just sat there, about 6 feet away, licking the side of her paw and washing her face like any house cat would. But this wasn't a house cat. Her eyes were alert, her muscles still coiled tight. Lonnie knew she was ready to bolt at the first wrong move, so he didn't try to touch her. Didn't speak again. He just watched. After a minute, she stood, shook out her legs, and trotted back into the woods. Lonnie put the parsley back in the bag, a little crushed now, and shook his head with a grin. He didn't know what to make of it. But something had changed. Over the next few weeks, the bobcat's injured leg began to heal. She put more weight on it. Her movements became smoother. Lonnie noticed that she started hunting again. Once, he saw her leap into a patch of tall weeds and come out with something small in her mouth. Probably a vole or a bird. He started leaving out water instead of meat. Then he placed a frozen rabbit carcass from the rehab center deep in the yard, hidden beneath brush, forcing her to search for it. He scattered food instead of placing it in dishes. He wanted her instincts to take over again. He wanted her to go back to the wild. And she did, mostly. But every now and then, she returned to the yard. Once, Lonnie was sitting on the porch reading when he noticed her walking slowly across the lawn. She didn't make a sound. She didn't look at him. She just laid down in the grass a few yards away, tucked her paws beneath her chest, and closed her eyes. For nearly half an hour, neither of them moved. The sun sank lower. The sky turned gold and pink. And for those few moments, it felt like peace. He didn't talk to her. He didn't reach for her. He just sat there. And she stayed. That night, when she was gone, Lonnie stood by the door before heading inside and said quietly, "You've got your strength back. Don't stay too long." A few days later, Lonnie decided it was finally time to fix the section of fence where the bobcat had gotten stuck. It had been bent and rusted long before that day. But now, it felt like a scar on his land, a wound he needed to heal properly. He grabbed his tools, a pair of work gloves, and headed out in the early afternoon. The sun was warm, but not harsh, and the shade from the pines offered just enough relief to keep him steady. As he reached the damaged part of the fence, he knelt down and began pulling out the old, twisted wire. He was so focused on the task, unwinding staples, straightening posts, that he didn't notice he had company until he felt it. That feeling, like someone watching. He turned his head slowly. Just 10 yards away, sitting calmly on a large fallen log, was the bobcat. She didn't move. Her ears were up, her eyes locked on him, her body still. But there was no growl, no sign of fear. She was simply watching. He didn't speak right away, just gave her a quiet nod and returned to his work. But after a few minutes, he looked up again. She was still there, still watching. So he decided to talk. "You see this?" he said, holding up the cutters. "This is what caught your leg. Wasn't meant to. Just got lazy about checking it." The bobcat blinked, slowly. Lonnie smiled at that. He'd seen cats do that blink when they felt calm, a soft signal. Maybe it meant the same here. He kept talking, not expecting a response, just letting the words flow. "I'm fixing it now. Not gonna let it happen again. Not to you, not to any creature that walks through here. He finished cutting the last piece and pulled the old wire free, coiling it carefully to take to the dump later. As he hammered the new section into place, he looked back one more time. She was gone. No sound, no warning. Just vanished like smoke into the woods. But the space she had occupied still felt full somehow, like she had left part of herself there, or maybe just the weight of her presence. Lonnie stood, wiped the sweat from his neck, and whispered to the empty log, "Thanks for the company." That evening, his neighbor Earl was out walking his dog along the road. Earl was in his 70s, still strong, but slow in movement. He spotted Lonnie near the porch and called out over the fence, "Hey, Lonnie, that true I saw a bobcat on your porch last week?" Lonnie didn't lie. He never had much use for it. "Yeah," he said. "She's been coming around. Got caught in my fence. I helped her out." Earl frowned. "You sure that's safe?" Lonnie shrugged. "She's not a pet. She's not tame. I don't try to touch her. I just gave her space when she needed it." The older man shook his head, half amused, half concerned. "Well, don't be surprised if she shows up with friends." Lonnie chuckled. "I'd be honored." The conversation ended there, but the story didn't. Word spread slowly through Sand Hollow. Some folks admired Lonnie for his calm approach. Others thought he was out of his mind for letting a predator linger so close to home. But he didn't argue with anyone. He just kept doing what felt right. Let her be wild. Let her heal. Let her choose. And she kept choosing to come back. As the weeks passed, the bobcat's visits became less frequent. She no longer appeared every morning or evening. Sometimes, she didn't come for days. Then a full week went by with no sign of her at all. Lonnie noticed it. Of course he did. But he didn't panic. He told himself this was good. This was right. She was recovering. She was moving on. That's what wild animals were supposed to do. He reminded himself of that every time he glanced toward the trees and saw nothing. Every time he poured water into the dish near the tree line and found it untouched. Every time the dusk came and went without a flicker of movement in the shadows. Still, it left a hollow ache in his chest. To fill the time, Lonnie returned to old routines. He volunteered again at the Wildlife Rehab Center in Caldwell, just like he used to. They always needed help. In the first week back, he cleaned out the aviary for the hawks, helped a fawn with a leg brace, and bottle-fed 3 baby squirrels that had fallen from a nest during a storm. Each rescue had its own rhythm, its own story, and each one reminded him that nature moved on, with or without you. He still left water out near the woods. Habit, more than hope. And even though the dish stayed full most mornings, he couldn't quite bring himself to stop. Once, late in the evening, he heard something move through the brush. A faint rustle, then silence. He got up and walked out to check, heart pounding with the kind of foolish hope he thought he'd outgrown. It was a fox. It looked up at him, blinked, and vanished. Not her. Winter came early that year. The snow was thick, and the wind cut sharper than it had in years. Lonnie bundled up every morning to check on the chickens, salt the steps, and make sure the heat tape around the pipes was holding. The forest turned quiet, truly quiet. Some days, the only tracks he saw in the snow were deer and rabbits. A few times coyote prints, never hers. He started to accept that she was gone. She hadn't been his to begin with. No collar, no name, no promise. Just a shared moment of trust that had lasted longer than he ever expected. But still, it hurt. He found himself walking the edge of the fence more than usual. Not doing anything. Just looking. Watching the trees. remembering where she had stood, where she had lain down in the grass, where she had looked back at him with those fierce, steady eyes. He whispered once, out loud, to no one, "You don't owe me anything." By spring, the snow melted. Wildflowers returned. The air grew softer, warmer. Birds sang in the mornings, and the yard came alive again. But he had stopped expecting her. Not out of bitterness, just understanding. Some animals leave, some never return, and that's part of it. Part of loving something wild. You give, you step back, and sometimes you're lucky enough to be remembered. It was a cool evening in early October, years after Lonnie had last seen the bobcat. He had just finished fixing the old barn door, which had started sagging again. With a cup of hot coffee in his hands, he eased into his creaky porch chair and leaned back, listening to the sounds of dusk. The trees were nearly bare, their red and gold leaves fluttering down like slow-moving snow. Crickets chirped quietly in the distance. The wind had a bite to it now, the kind that reminded you winter was around the corner. He didn't expect anything. But just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned orange, he heard movement by the edge of the fence. At first, he thought it was a deer. The shape was low to the ground, but fluid, confident, not nervous. Then he saw the eyes. Golden, bright, familiar. His heart skipped a beat. The bobcat stepped into view. She looked different now, larger, stronger. Her coat was thicker. Her walk had purpose. And across her ankle, under all that fur, he could just barely make out a faint scar where the wire had once torn her skin. She stared at him for a long moment. Lonnie slowly stood from his chair and set the coffee mug on the rail. He didn't speak, didn't move toward her. Then, to his amazement, she walked forward. Not all the way to the porch, just far enough to lay something down in the grass near the first step. It was a rabbit, freshly caught, still warm, a gift. Lonnie blinked in disbelief. He knew enough about animal behavior to understand what this meant. Bobcats don't bring food to people. They don't share kills. But this wasn't about food. This was about something else. Recognition, memory, thanks. Before he could say a word, two small shapes appeared behind her. Bobcat kittens. They were clumsy, barely coordinated, with oversized paws and bright, curious eyes. They tumbled out of the brush, squeaking and chasing each other's tails, then stopped when they saw him. Lonnie knelt down slowly, staying still. Letting them approach if they chose to, he held out a hand, palm down. The kittens crept forward, noses twitching, before giving his fingers a few soft taps with their tiny, velveted paws. Then they darted back to their mother, who remained still, calm, alert, but unafraid. And then something happened that nearly broke him. The mother bobcat stepped forward and gently pressed the side of her head against Lonnie's jaw, a quick, quiet gesture, before pulling away again. No sound, no warning, just trust. His eyes welled with tears as he leaned down and whispered, "You made it." For a moment, everything was still. Just a man, a wild cat, and two tiny lives connecting on a quiet October night. Then, as quickly as they had come, they gathered around the rabbit. She picked it back up in her jaws, gave him one last look, and turned. The kittens followed. And just before they vanished into the trees, she looked over her shoulder one more time. Her eyes caught the fading light. It was the same look she had given him the day he freed her from the fence, but this time it felt fuller, like it carried something heavier, not just survival, but gratitude. Lonnie remained on his knees long after the bobcat and her kittens disappeared into the woods. He could still feel the pressure of her head against his chin, as if the moment had carved itself into his skin. The porch was quiet again. The air carried only the smell of leaves, pine, and faint traces of wild fur. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote barked, but Lonnie didn't move. His hands rested on his thighs, and his eyes were wet. He finally stood up, picked up his now cold coffee, and sat back down in his porch chair. That was it. The moment he never expected, and yet had waited for all this time. He let out a long breath and whispered, "You did good, girl. You did real good." The next morning, Lonnie went to the wildlife rehab center like he did every Thursday. That day, instead of starting with chores, he asked to speak with a group of new volunteers. Most of them were young, college kids, animal science majors, a few retired folks like him. They gathered in a half circle in the meeting room as Lonnie stood in front of them, his hands loosely clasped. "I want to tell you a story," he said. "It's not about saving animals in cages. It's about trust. And it started with a busted fence." He told them everything. How he found the bobcat. How he almost walked away. How he fought through the fear and used his training to help. How she came back, over and over. How he learned to respect the space she needed. How he never tried to own her, name her, or control her. And then, he told them about last night. A few of the younger ones gasped when he described the kittens. When he mentioned the rabbit, the gift, one of the older volunteers, a quiet woman in her 50s, placed her hand over her heart. And when he told them about the head bump, the silent thank you, the room was completely still. "I didn't save her so she could be mine," Lonnie said. "I helped her because it was the right thing to do. And she came back when she was ready, not before." He looked around the room. Don't forget that. Compassion doesn't mean taming something. Sometimes the best thing you can do is let it go. The story became something of a legend at the center. People called it the Sand Hollow Bobcat story. Some didn't believe it, others did. But Lonnie didn't care. He hadn't done it for praise. At home, life went on. He still chopped firewood, still mended fences, still made coffee on the porch every morning. He still listened for the sound of movement in the woods. Not out of longing, but because that part of his life had changed him. Sometimes, he thought he saw something in the distance. A shadow that lingered, a flash of gold behind the trees. Sometimes he imagined soft paws stepping lightly near the fence line. He never fed her again. He never saw the kittens again either. But he knew they were out there, learning to survive, learning to trust, learning when to run and when to stay. And that was enough. The seasons continued to turn in Sand Hollow. By the following year, Lonnie had more gray in his beard, more creaks in his knees, and more stories to tell. But one story always stood out. When visitors came to the wildlife center, school groups, tourists, or curious locals, someone would inevitably ask, "Is that the guy with the bobcat?" And the answer was always yes. Sometimes he'd be asked to tell the story again. Sometimes he would. Sometimes he wouldn't. It depended on the day and the audience, and how quiet the woods had felt that morning. But when he did tell it, he told it simply. No dramatic music, no exaggeration. Just a man, a wild animal, and the choice not to turn away. He never tried to replace her. He had other rescues. A great horned owl with a broken wing, a fox kit that had fallen into a dry well, a baby raccoon that lost its mother to a passing car. Each of them came and went. Each of them healed or didn't. But none stayed with him the way she had. That bobcat, unnamed, untamed, had marked something in him, not with claws or teeth, but with silence, with presence, with return. Years later, when Lonnie stood at the edge of his property, looking out toward the tree line, he still sometimes felt her there. Not physically, she was long gone, but in the way the grass swayed, the way the air shifted when the sun dropped low, and in the lessons he passed on. Don't make a wild animal into a pet, he'd tell young volunteers. Don't make their pain about you. Help if you can, then let go. He'd point to the repaired section of fence and say, "Right there, that's where she got stuck." That's where everything changed. Lonnie never saw the bobcat again. Not truly. But on cold mornings, when the frost clung to the porch rail and the steam rose from his coffee, he would glance toward the trees and imagine he heard soft steps. He would whisper, "Take care of your babies." And in his heart, he'd hear the low chuff of a bobcat's breath and feel the brush of her head against his once more. Not as a goodbye, but as a reminder that even the wildest things, the ones with claws and fangs and fire in their eyes, can recognize kindness. And sometimes, just sometimes, they come back to say thank you.